You mentioned NDEs, and I mentioned that I'm a spiritualist medium. Probably 20 years ago, I came to the conclusion that the only place you could find, if you like, evidence for non-local consciousness would be in things like spiritualism, reincarnation, near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences. So I looked in those areas, and I got quite interested in near-death experiences, and then I wasn't expecting it, but I had one myself.
Really?
I had a major heart operation back in 2016, and following the operation, when I came round and got back to living again, I used to stand every morning looking out of my bedroom window, sometimes for 20 minutes, fully understanding on a really deep and really profound level the interconnectedness of all life and everything. I understood it on an intuitive level that I'd never appreciated ever before in my life. And I spoke to the missus about it, and she said, well, you know, you've been through a major thing where you could have died, and now you're appreciating the value of being alive. And so I went. I was. This was about 2 years ago or so. I went on just a one-day conference on consciousness, and I'm just trying to think who was running that one. Can't remember, but there was a woman called Dr. Penny Sartori. Have you come across that name?
I've spoken with her.
Yes. Well, I spoke to her,
mm-hmm.
and she gave us a lecture on near-death experiences, and I said to her, I think I might have had a near-death experience because of some of the things she was talking about. This profound understanding of the interconnectedness of everything being an example.
So it was almost like you had the effects of the experience, but don't consciously remember having one.
That's right, yes. And what she said was that not all near-death experiences are actually remembered, just like dreams are not always remembered.
Mm.
You know, some people have near-death experiences and remember them, some people don't. But what you can't get away from is the effect it has on you.
Mm.
And literally within 2 months of me having the heart operation, at this point I didn't know I'd had a near-death experience. I didn't realise that until a year later, till I spoke to Penny. And I got this really deep desire to finally put my money where my mouth was and actually do some real, proper investigation of my own rather than just reading other people's stuff into spiritual mediumship. So I joined the spiritual development class at Windsor Spiritualist Church, and I was surprised. It was actually run by a guy who had just retired. He was a retired chief executive of a group of IT companies. On the course, there was an oncologist, a cancer doctor, who was just looking forward to being made a consultant. Mm-hmm. There was a lawyer. There was a project manager. There was me, a research scientist. We were a bunch of people seeking the truth. And I stayed on the course for about 18 months. And I initially went on there just to see, well, is this experience that I had with my father proof that I'm a medium? I should say we're all mediums. We're all capable of it. It's just a matter of whether you train yourself to take notice of your subconscious. And anyway, in the group, we only there was about 20 of us in the group, and we gave readings to one another, and sometimes we stood on the platform and gave readings to the group and stuff like that. And we did all sorts of exercises in inspirational speaking, in other words, letting your subconscious speak rather than your mind, that sort of thing. Now, there's a guy called Darren Brown. What he does, he uses hypnotic techniques to precondition his audience, and then they film him giving readings to the audience, and the audience go, yes, that's absolutely right. Well, what the story we're not told is that he's hypnotized them in advance, and planted the ideas in her head that if I say this to you, you will say that's absolutely right. And then at the end, he comes on and he says, see, all mediumship is lies, because I'm not a medium. I made all that up, and she confirmed it all. There's a logical fallacy in all of that, which is just because you can simulate a real effect doesn't mean that the real effect doesn't exist. And Derren Brown and James Randi, their argument really boils down to that. It boils down to they can fake mediumship and they can fake psi phenomena. Yeah, fair enough. So you can simulate it. That doesn't make psi phenomena false.
No.
That claim is not substantiated. It's not right. And I've had this argument plenty of times with scientists, but
yeah, I was gonna mention, especially I like to mention James Randi, because the whenever you go online, you look at near-death experience, or you look at mediumship, you look at out-of-body experience verification, things like that, you get met consistently every time with, well, someone would have won the James Randi prize, so why don't you go and do that? You know, that sort of thing.
Yes.
And it's so frequent now that the prize isn't available anymore, but it's still brought up. And I wonder.
Yeah, did you read the article? It appeared actually in the last few weeks on Facebook, where they were debunking James Randi's claim that the prize was ever actually available. He basically just every time anybody came close to having a chance of winning the prize, he changed the rules. You know, it was like you've got to prove it under my terms and my conditions. Otherwise the money's not available. And he made sure that his terms and conditions were such that it couldn't be proved.
I remember reading something as well that the participants had to fund it themselves after a certain level, or something like that. I might be wrong, but I've read that somewhere.
Well, I might sound disingenuous towards magicians by saying that they're professional liars, but the reason why I say that in the context of the magicians who try to debunk spiritual stuff using their lies and their tricks are basically, they're in it for their own ends. They're in it. Well, Derren Brown he's in it to make money out of the TV, isn't he? So if he can come on the TV and say something controversial like, I can prove that spiritualism isn't real, well, that gets him an audience. And does he care whether he's right or wrong? No. All he cares about is getting the money for it at the end of the day. James Randi's exactly the same. He put out the $1 million prize because he knew it to get him a lot of publicity. And he's a showman.
And it worked.
Yeah, he's a showman. He got the publicity. I couldn't be asked to look at any of the experiments that he so-called ran and the psychics he so-called debunked, because it was such a setup. It was such a theatrical event. It wasn't a scientific experiment. It was a stunt.
And I think that's the case with a lot of the professional skeptics out there whose career depends on being able to debunk this sort of thing.
Well, in some ways you can't blame them for that, because imagine that you're a professor and you've got a tenure at a top university, and your theory is a materialist theory of reality. Your whole existence, the whole of your life and your purpose for living is based on defending your materialist point of view. And if a new paradigm comes along, and it has come along now, it's the new paradigm for consciousness is here, it's with us. If that threatens your materialistic models and you're not prepared to change them, what does that do to your career? So these people have got a vested interest in debunking. And I'm not, by the way, I'm not saying that that I go into this with my eyes closed and I accept all claims for psi phenomena are real. Obviously not. I mean, I'm a scientist myself, and I look for evidence. But can evidence ever be gained using the standard scientific method? Do you know what the definition of the standard scientific method? Basically, this is a fundamental principle. This is Science 101. Fundamental principle is somebody starts off with a hypothesis or a conjecture, often based initially on some anecdotal evidence. Something occurs that needs explaining. Let's set up some sort of trial, some sort of experiment to test it. Then what you do is you set up, you design an experiment
to falsify it, don't you?
To falsify the hypothesis. That's right. And basically, you do. I was talking earlier. What you try to do is you try to show that the results that the experiment has discovered are no better than random chance.
Mm-hmm.
And if they're no better than random chance, it's not a phenomenon. But of course, the scientific method requires that an experiment be set up within the confines of what they're trying to prove. And as I said earlier, if you can't find a way of ruling out the psychic effect of the observers of the experiment, then your experiment's not going to produce very good results, or it'll produce results that conform to the beliefs of the experimenters. But that in itself is a result, if you think about it.
It is, yeah. It's just whether that point is recognised or not, isn't it?
It's not recognised. I make the point. If you say what I've discovered over the 30 years I've been doing this now, if you say it often enough, and if you're consistent with your message, eventually the message will sink in, and you'll start seeing people who were previously skeptical will start thinking, well, could that be right? And then they'll start perhaps not espousing the idea, but saying, could this be right? Could it be the case that this is real evidence? Once people start asking the question, that's as far as you need to get, because once the question is starting to be asked, that's when we start getting some proper investigation into it. What happens at the moment? A lot of Rupert Sheldrake's a fine example of this. I never said that at the end of the experiment has to then go through peer review. In other words, independent objective scientists need to look at your methodology, look at your results, look at your analysis, and they need to validate that they consider that you've been objective all the way through and that your experimental design's been right. And then finally, it needs to be repeatable by independent experimenters who are not you. What happened a lot with Rupert Sheldrake's experiments is that nobody repeated them. He produced results. He tried to get them published, and the peer reviewers of I can't remember which magazine it was, but it was one of the top scientific magazines. The reviewer just rejected his rejected his article. You've probably read about this.
Yeah, I can't remember which magazine it was. You're right; it's one of the top ones.
Yeah,
well, it wasn't the Lancet. Van Lommel.
It might have been Nature or something like that.
Something like that. Yeah.
But anyway, they rejected it without looking at it because it obviously must be false because it doesn't agree with the paradigm.
Yeah.
And famously, Rupert got the best bit of publicity he could ever got. TEDx took down one of his. You've seen it, the forbidden video. Who hasn't seen that video now because they took it down? They shot themselves in the foot with that one.
Was it taken down completely, or was it just removed from the main?
It was taken down. Yes,
it was taken down.
They had a lot of objections from materialistic scientists and reductionists who said that he was being apocryphal, which he was. He was questioning some of the fundamental assumptions of science, and one of which is the speed of light constant. I seem to recall, and they got so many objections that TED decided to take it offline. But they got such a backlash from the user base that they had to put it back online again. Which is why it reappeared.
Right, I see.
And but the publicity it got as a result of that made sure that a lot more people saw that video than would have otherwise seen it. So I don't know where we're going to go, but I've sensed over the last 30 years the paradigm changing. When I first started to talk, when I first started to crack the idea of higher dimensional consciousness, I remember I used to talk about it in the pub. Not a good place to talk about deep philosophical subjects, let me tell you. And one of my friends he managed to convince the others that I'd actually gone mad and I was living in the shed at the bottom of the garden now.
Really?
because I was spouting this theory of consciousness, and I didn't realize at the time how far above people's heads it was, the idea of multi-dimensions and stuff. And,
it's not something that you generally think about, is it? I mean, you think of going to work, what you got to do the next day. Consciousness, transcendental consciousness isn't really something that comes into your daily life usually.
No, and I quite often, quite a few of my friends say to me, Jeff, why are you interested in this? Why are you even bothered? Why does it matter? And my attitude is, it matters because I had an experience that I'm trying to explain, and I've reached a point now where I've explained it. I read a book while I was away on holiday last year called Human Akash. Have you come across the concept of the Akashic record?
Mm-hmm.
It's the book of life. It was an expression that I'd heard many times. I didn't really know much about it, and what it basically said in this book, which I concurred with, was that we are not four-dimensional beings. We're multi-dimensional beings, and that the Akashic record, if you like, the Akashic record, I interpret as being the grand unified field. By the way, so the book of life, the fountain of all knowledge, the repository of all information that exists is the Akashic record, and that we are constantly feeding our own experience into the Akashic record. But it said that we're not four-dimensional beings. We don't just live in space-time. We exist in this multidimensional manifold. And when our physical body dies, that's just the physical part of our existence, the temporary physical part of our existence, which is gone. But our actual connection between lives, if you like, the thing that explains reincarnation, the connection between lives is that part of us which existed in the higher dimensions while our bodies were alive, and still exists after our bodies have died, and then can reincarnate into another body. Whether that's right or wrong, I don't know, but it's interesting.
It is. How do you think the brain plays into the role of consciousness? I mean, do you think it's the brain that gives us the awareness, or is that the consciousness itself from a panpsychic view? Well,
let me refer you back to what I was talking previously about, the two definitions of consciousness with the big C and with the small c. I think our brains, one of the major functions of our brain is to interface this physical body with reality. In other words, to manage the senses, to manage the maintenance and upkeep of the physical mechanism, and to basically do all the housekeeping necessary to keep us alive.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also got an interface with the higher dimensional side of our existence, the spiritual side of our existence. And for my money, I think it's something to do with I'm just speaking about stuff that I don't know a lot about, but I've read a little about the pineal gland,
mm-hmm.
which is in here, the third eye, and the limbic system. And so our brains are capable of generating awareness from the field of consciousness. So basically, we exist. Our physical bodies and our spiritual bodies exist within a multidimensional manifold. We are multidimensional beings. We're not four-dimensional beings, and that our brain is the thing that converts information into awareness, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm.
And the question often arises, and I've pondered this for 30 years, of, well, what is existence after death? When your physical body dies,
yeah,
is there an afterlife? I'm saying categorically that there is, but we need a caveat on what do you actually mean by an afterlife. Is an afterlife anything like our existing life? Well, how can it be? We don't have eyes to see. We don't have a nose to smell. We don't have ears to hear. We don't have a physical body to touch and sense and taste. How could our existence beyond physical death of the body be anything like what we perceive as our existence while we're alive? It can't be. But I doubt if the words exist to actually describe it in three-dimensional space-time terms as to what existence is beyond death. It's pure awareness, because we all belong. We're all instances of the same universal universal field of consciousness. So it's reasonable to assume that the information, I'm using that word in the sort of integrated information theory idea, the information that represents our spirit, our existence, our individuality, continues to exist. In fact, in science, we're all taught in school about the conservation of energy, the conservation of momentum. Add to that list the conservation of information. I think that was Stephen Hawking's. I think what he said was matter is not annihilated when it goes into a black hole. A black hole, its information exists in the event horizon of the black hole, or something like that. Anyway, conservation of information, and that's what's meant by a life after death. Your awareness persists. It's my speculation about what would actually happen in reality is that we hear about people passing through this tunnel going towards a light. That is probably our detaching of the physical body from the field. And once the physical body is detached, the physical body acts like a brake. It acts like a slowing mechanism. So it reduces our vibration. So once the physical body is detached, we become multidimensional beings, and we have a type of awareness which is pan-dimensional, more than universal, and it's no longer local. In other words, it's no longer individual. So we all know that we all know about our higher self, the person that I can say now, I'm aware of the fact that I'm speaking to you. I'm also aware of the fact that I'm thinking about that part of me which is aware that I'm speaking to you.
Yeah.
I'm also aware of the fact that I've just said that. So therefore, it's like the answer on the back, isn't it? That can go on infinitely. Infinite awareness is something that I don't think we can hope to explain in human terms, and I don't think there's any. Actually, I don't think there's any point in trying to. So you might then say, well, if you've then merged into the field of consciousness, if your body's detached and all the information that represents you, your spirit, your soul, everything is in the Akashic record and it still exists, what is it that mediums are actually coming up with? Are they actually talking to your Auntie Doris or whatever? Well, yes and no. The information that represents the entity that was your Auntie Doris is there in the Akashic record, and mediums somehow that they don't understand and nobody understands can access localized parts of the Akashic record. Whether those accesses, let's call them, are driven by the person that you're giving the reading to. In other words, is the person that you're reading actually somehow directing you to their deceased relatives in the Akashic record? I don't know. There must be some mechanism.
Yeah.
Because as I said earlier, it works. Mediumship is real. There are fake mediums out there. Yes, they might even be in the majority. I don't know. But there are real mediums out there. I'm a real medium. I don't fake anything. I don't try to prove that I'm a medium to people. That's why I don't do public platform work, because I see that as trying to prove things to people, and I'm not interested. It's not my job to prove anything to anybody other than myself. I know from my own experience of what I've witnessed other mediums doing, of what I've done myself. I know that this is a true phenomenon. My only question, it isn't whether it's true or false, it's what's the mechanism, how does it work?
How it works, yeah. Well, what do you think then about things like near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences where the consciousness apparently separates from the physical body but retains its ability to sense as through the traditional five senses that we'd understand, and can get, veridical perception?
Yes.
Because, as you say, if you can imagine a life after death, we wouldn't imagine it'd be anything like what we experience because we don't have the eyes, etc. But we still seem to have those perceptions and the sense of individuality.
Well, this is where I get flamed by the NDE faction of life, because my views on near-death experiences are quite controversial. I accept that everyone who remembers their near-death experience, and particularly the ones that had an out-of-body experience where they came back with some sort of radical evidence that they'd been out of body, I accept that experience was real. What I don't accept is that it was an example of life after death, or even anything to do with death. The one definition of near-death experiences is that they are not death. They're near-death experiences. They're people who've come close to dying, but didn't actually die. And in all my experience of spiritualism, I have never, not once ever, the proper definition of never, I have never heard any medium bring through a message from a spirit person where they describe the spirit world in the sort of terms that people describe near-death experiences in. I think near-death experiences are, and this comes from the work that they've done on dimethyltryptamine. You know that the DMT does give people spiritual experiences.
Yeah.
It even gives people shared hallucinations where several people who take ayahuasca can have the same hallucination at the same time. There's definitely something going on with near-death experiences, not with DMT, which generates a similar experience to a near-death experience, a witnessed near-death experience. Now, what I would say, and this is just my speculation, is that that what you perceive as the reality of you sitting there talking to me over Zoom is nothing more than a hallucination. Because basically our bodies are only capable of filtering information that comes into us via our senses, whatever those senses might be, and then it heavily edits the information it receives in order to make sense of the world in terms that we want to understand it.
We only perceive as far as our brain can interpret information. Yeah,
exactly. Something happens when people take DMT and when they have near-death experiences where the normal filters are bypassed, and all experience, including that part of us which is higher dimensional, is accessible by our minds, whatever that might mean, our mind. But does that mean that that's what it's like to be dead? Well, I don't know is the answer, and I don't think anybody knows the answer to that. But I think not. I think it's just a different form of hallucination. We tend not to realise that our existence, our normal day-to-day lives, is an hallucination in its own right. I mean, two identical twins can be standing side by side in the same spot at the same time and witness the environment that they're in slightly differently. It's because, why is that? It's because our minds filter all our experience and all of our awareness through its own complex filter, which is based on our life experiences to date, our understanding of reality, spirituality, science, our expectations and desires, our prejudices, all these filters, millions of filters, take in everything that we're experiencing in the moment to produce one acceptable to us impression of what our life's actually doing right now. That's not an objective truth. None of us are viewing the world in any objective way. We're all completely and utterly subjective. While I'm on that subject, I'll just tell you about a little calculation I did. I was out on my boat. I had a boat some years ago on the Thames, and you'd moor up on an afternoon, and you'd think, well, what shall I do now? And I thought, well, I think this is me. I'll have a play with the time dilation equation, Einstein's theory of special relativity, to see what sort of effects time dilation can have if you apply it to mundane speeds. The time dilation effect is often it's often quoted as being, if you travel close to the speed of light, time for you slows down. So you travel out into the universe at 2/3 the speed of light. You come back, you are 3 days older, and the world's moved on 100 years. Yeah. You know, that's the way it's usually presented. So I thought, well, so I did the calculation based on if I walk away from you a distance of 1 meter, to make the numbers easy, at 1 meter per second, what time dilation would occur if I plug those numbers into the equation. And it turned out it was something like 10 to the minus 23 of a second. We would have dilated in time. So in other words, I'd be in a different time frame to you by 10 to the minus 23 of a second, just by virtue of walking away from you. And if you accept, and this is a big if, do you accept that reality unfolds one Planck frame at a time? A Planck frame, I think, is 10 to the minus 35, isn't it? Seconds. Anyway, the long and short of it is, if reality unfolds one Planck frame at a time, and a Planck is 10 to the minus 35 of a second, and you've just dilated your time relative to the person you walked away from by 10 to the minus 23 or whatever, the numbers are in the blog, I can't remember them exactly, then you've moved into a different reality. Just by virtue of the fact that you've physically moved away from them at speed, at any speed. It also applies, I don't know if you know, time dilation applies to gravity as well. So the geostationary satellites that do the global positioning system, they, because they're in a different gravitational framework to what we're in on the Earth's surface, the calculations of your position on Earth have to make a 1/45 billionth of a second per day correction to account for the fact that they're in a different time frame to us.
Yeah.
time dilation effect. And if they didn't make that correction after a week, you'd be 1 kilometer out. You know, so these things are real. So I put these ideas to some. Well, one of them was a professor of quantum mechanics, and I said to him, so explain, where have I gone wrong with these calculations? If you'll accept my initial premise that reality unfolds one Planck frame at a time, doesn't this just show that we're all existing in our own separate realities by virtue of the fact that we're moving relative to one another, and we're in different gravitational fields relative to one another? And he looked at it and he said, well, there's nothing wrong with the calculation, but these effects only really happen at significant speeds. You know, the time dilation effect, you need to be a significant proportion of the speed of light for it to have any real effect, measurable effect. And I said, okay, so what's the boundary condition that defines the point at which it stops being negligible? It stops being non-existent and starts to be real. What's the rule that says that's the boundary at which that happens? No answer. You know, if it works at the speed of light or close to the speed of light, it works at all speeds. So we all actually exist in our own separate realities, by dint of the fact that we're moving relative to one another, and we've got different gravitational
different times. Yeah.
And there's no doubt about it that time dilation is real, because it was tested by those two atomic clocks. One was left on the ground; they were synchronized. One was left on the ground. One was sent up in a jumbo jet that flew around for, I think, 24 hours till it ran out of fuel, and then came back down again. And it's been moving at about 500 miles an hour for 20 hours or whatever. They calculated what the time dilation ought to have been in billionths of a second, and they compared the two clocks, and it was correct. There was a time dilation. So we know it's real. We know it, and we know it does work at mundane speeds of only 500 miles an hour. So why when I do that with my arm, why my hand has got into a different frame of reality to the elbow, because my hand's moved relative to the elbow.
Yeah.
None of this makes any sense. And I think the standard reply from most scientists is, well, these are just mathematical models. Don't take them too literally. Okay, well, where do you draw the line? At which point do you want to say, we'll take that part of the model literally, and we won't take that part of the model literally? I don't know.
At that point, it's just ignoring, because it doesn't have, let's just say, a reasonable effect over our lives. So why, I suppose, worry about it too much?
Yeah, but, it's completely imperceptible. The idea that reality unfolds one Planck frame at a time comes from this multiverse theory, that every Planck unit of time the universe splits. So therefore there are so many versions of the universe that it's infinite. And if you wanted to get your head around that one, if you do it with a sort of a 2D, 3D model, you can say, well, a sheet of paper, you consider that to be a 2D plane. It's got length and it's got width. And how many three-dimensional planes are there? How many sheets of paper can you stack? Well, it's an infinite number, isn't it? How many sheets of paper are there in the third dimension? How many two-dimensional sheets of paper make up the third dimension? Well, equally, you could say, well, how many? Let's say that the Earth is four-dimensional space and time, and let's say there's a fifth dimension. How many four-dimensional spaces are there in the fifth dimension? There's an infinite number of them. How many fifth-dimensional spaces are there in the sixth dimension? And so on, right up to 11, if you like. So you've got infinity beyond infinity, beyond infinity, beyond infinity. And that's not something that the human mind can
perceive.
It's
conceptualize.
It's too much. There's one of my big things that I've been trying to argue in the last sort of 6 months is that there is actually only one infinite thing that exists. And let me define what I mean by thing. In mathematics, there are infinite series. There are infinite sets, like the set of real numbers is infinite. Any number you can come up with, I can always add one to it. But is there anything actually in reality that's infinite? Is the universe infinite? Well, most scientific theories say that the universe is bounded. But outside the universe is a thing called the void, which it's the question of what's the universe expanding into. It's expanding. It's not expanding into something. It's generating new space from within. It's generating new space-time from within. So in that sense, it's expanding, but it's expanding into this thing that's called the void, but which can't be defined mathematically. It defies mathematical description. It's infinity beyond infinity beyond infinity with dimensions. So there could be an infinite number of realities. There could be an infinite number of realities where a flower has just burst into bloom. It's in Maidstone, Kent. And there could be another version of reality that's identical in every way, except that flower burst into bloom a quarter of a second later. And then another one where it was half a second later. You know what I mean? Where an electron changed its state from one state to another state in this universe, but there's another universe that's identical in every way except for that electron didn't change its state. You know, getting your head around the infinite nature.
The numbers of that, yeah.
So is there anything in reality, anything in reality that's not just a concept, not just a mathematical idea? Is there anything in reality that is actually infinite? And I think, and I'm arguing at the moment, it's the grand unified field. So consciousness itself is infinite. But don't ask me to define it, because how can you define something that's infinite? Because in order to define something, you need to put it in a set. If you put it in a set, the set has to have a boundary.
Yeah, it's no longer infinite.
Yes, exactly. So you stray into the realms of philosophy there, and I did study philosophy for a short while, and I just found it too difficult for me. It's too much concentration on what other people have said rather than what you think. That was there you go.
Yeah, I dabbled very slightly into philosophy for a very short time, and it really bends your mind.
Yeah, I have people asking me questions like, how do you think panpsychism differs from idealism or monism or dualism? And my answer to that is I don't really care. Yeah. You know, I'm a panpsychist, and I've got my own definition of what panpsychism means. I don't really care on how it differs from other philosophies. That's the one after 30 years and a lot of thinking about, I'm satisfied with. And if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. So what?
Yeah.
So if it turns out when I die, it's all gone, and that's it, well, I won't be there to worry about it, will I? If, on the other hand, when I die, my awareness does persist, and in some ways it's still capable of being encapsulated or localized in some sort of way, then I'll say, I told you so. Does it matter? I think most people's fear of death, and you mentioned this earlier, that you were concerned about your own mortality. I think a lot of people are not actually afraid of being dead. They're just afraid of the transition between where they are now and being dead. Because once you're dead, you're dead. And if it's a void and there's nothing there, and if it's all, your existence ceases, you won't be there to regret it. And if, on the other hand, as I believe, your awareness in some way survives, then what's the worry? Your awareness, the essence of you is still in existence, even if your body isn't. It's just the process, I think, of going between.
The idea of death that frightens me is just the thought of being unconscious forever and not being able to kind of imagine what that would be, never experiencing again for eternity, but not having a sense of time to know that. Just the concept of that, the idea, is terrifying to me.
Well, we haven't really talked much about time, but I've tried for years to get my head around time, and all I can say in conclusion of what I've speculated, I'm trying to use my words carefully here, about what time might be, is that in some way time and conscious awareness are very closely related, and that time actually might be generated by conscious awareness. Time itself might be a function of conscious awareness. I don't know, and nobody does. Well, nobody I've spoken to, and I've read lots of very erudite articles on time. Universes where time runs backwards. I think that's the latest one that's doing the rounds at the moment. No matter how authoritative people might say they are on time, nobody really knows what time is. Nobody really knows whether time can run backwards, whether frames of existence exist forever and could possibly be revisited at some point. But on the subject of time travel, if you did revisit a frame of existence, in other words, part of your former life, once you got there, going forward, you wouldn't end up in the same universe that you left, because the universe is splitting every sort of 10 to the 45 times a second. So the chances of you ever getting back to where you started from is zero.
And your influence that you've played in that universe going back
exactly
is gonna
There are too many paradoxes with time travel.
It's difficult. So what do you think about when, again, in the near-death experience, you have things like the life review, where people are able to go back and experience panoramically their past experiences very accurately from many people's points of view?
Yes, I think that's the Akashic record. What they are is they're somehow they're accessing the Akashic record directly, and everything that's ever happened to you, not only from your point of view, but from everyone else that you've interacted with from their point of view, is there in the Akashic record. Every single instance of reality is recorded in the Akashic record. It's there. Don't ask me to explain what the mechanism is, because consciousness with a big C is fundamental. People ask the question, well, what's consciousness made of? Is it made of energy? No, consciousness is made of consciousness. Consciousness is consciousness. In fact, this sounds like a contradiction in terms, but consciousness is more fundamental than the fundamentals. It's like the ultimate fundamental, out of which all the other fundamentals come. Like mass and energy are fundamental, but consciousness is more fundamental. More fundamental. It's a silly expression, but so I think somehow we've got the ability. This brain thing we've got inside our head has got the processing ability to access that information field, the Akashic record, the grand unified field, and it's normally suppressed in our day-to-day lives. I don't think we could function in the world that we think we live in. I don't think we could function in that world unless we filtered out all the stuff that's actually there. Does that answer your question? I don't know.
Yeah, it does. Yeah. So essentially, that would suggest then that in a disembodied state, especially because these take place, when the brain isn't functioning properly, like Dr. Eben Alexander, for instance, who I've spoken with, who had the experience under severe bacterial meningitis when his brain was gone. It suggests then that even in an out-of-body state like that, some form of individuality can be experienced through the Akashic records.
Yes. There's a model of our individuality. That's the word I'm picking up on there, which is that our individuality is like it's a local instance of consciousness, a bit like a whirlpool in a stream. A whirlpool looks like an entity in its own right, doesn't it? But in fact, it's just something that happens within a stream, and the stream is made of water. But the actual whirlpool seems to have an existence in its own right as an entity. Well, I think that's what we are as individuals. We are like whirlpools in the field of consciousness. We're local instances of the universal field of consciousness, and that when our physical bodies cease to exist, our local existence, our particular whirlpool, if you like, ceases to exist and just becomes part of the whole. But that's not to say that while we're alive, we might not be able to experience, the context of our local existence in a broader sense. I don't know if that makes sense to you. I know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, I mean, people shout at me when I say I don't think near-death experiences are experiences of death. But I stick by that. I don't. I just think that there's some form of the brain's ability to hallucinate a different type of reality to the one that we normally hallucinate, the one that you and I are hallucinating at this moment in time. That in itself is controversial.
What do it makes sense, because you say, near death and death we know are very different. So what do you hear from, as a medium, from spirits, if you want to call it that, coming through, describing their existence on the other side, if you want to call it that, how do they describe their experience?
In fairly mundane terms, I think. And I'm not just speaking for myself here, I'm speaking for the mediums that I've seen giving messages to other people. A good medium, if you're interested in looking into mediumship, I think the most studied medium in the country at the moment is the so-called psychic barber, whose name has just escaped me. Gordon
Gordon
Smith. Gordon
yeah.
Smith. I've seen Gordon Smith performing a few times, and I think he's been the most scientifically studied medium in the country. So if you're interested in mediumship, start somewhere around about Gordon Smith, because you'll find more interesting.
Yeah, I think I've got one of his books.
Yes. Yeah.
I haven't read it in a long time.
Oh, I mean, I saw Gordon at someplace in London. I don't think it was a London spiritual mission, but where he not only gave someone the full name, surname, family name, and first name, but he gave them the address of where the grandmother lived as well, and described the house. You think so? Unless he's he's done some research on everybody in the audience before, and that's what he did, and he knows exactly where everybody's grandparents lived. Not. Yeah, he's very.
Doesn't seem likely. Yeah.
I think I'm avoiding your question actually, but
that's right. It's just because I know that a lot of mediums come through and they do describe kind of what life is like for those disembodied individuals.
Yes.
And a lot of it sounds very similar to earthly existence, but with more mental capability to kind of create and manipulate the environment.
Yes. Well, I've done some workshops with the Rudolf Steiner organisation. Have you heard of Rudolf Steiner? Yeah, they've got a place down near to Baker Street Station. It's about 500 metres from outside Baker Street. Come out of Baker Street Station, turn left, and it's there. And Rudolf Steiner himself was a German philosopher, and I think he was a psychologist as well. Well, he was one of those polymath types, and he was also a spiritual medium, and he wrote several erudite books on mediumship. And so I thought, well, given that he's got a scientific background, he wrote in the German academic language, I'll give it a go. And I went down to a couple of workshops, one of which was what happens when we die. What's the experience of dying? And I went into, there was about 8 or 9 of us in the workshop, and it was run by a medium called, I believe, is a consultant, anaesthetist in the NHS or something like that. Certainly she's high up in the NHS. Mm-hmm. And she introduced herself by saying, hello, I'm and I work for the NHS, but in my spare time I work with people who've recently died. Well, that got my interest straight away.
Yeah.
And we had a little exercise where we had to strike up a conversation with the person sitting next to us, discussing how we got to the venue that day. I went to Amersham Station, I caught a tube, blah blah blah, and while we were having this conversation, the organizer would then call out a month of the year, and if your birthday was in that month, you had to stop speaking in the middle of the sentence, stand up and walk out and get yourself a cup of coffee in the room next door. Mm-hmm. So of course they said, the first one they said was March, which is my birthday. Yeah. And 3 of us got up and walked out straight away. 3 of us born in March. And it's funny how people born in March tend to be more interested in spiritual stuff. Then again, all these people who believe in astrology would say that. But
yeah. December, I don't know what that means.
Anyway, so eventually everybody was outside and in the coffee room. So she came through and she said, right, when you die, the experience is very similar to the one you've just had. It's like you've just broken off a conversation in the middle of a conversation, and you've taken up a new place in a different room where your life goes on, as it in the same way that it's going on now.
Mm.
And I've never really been able to accept that. I mean, how can that be? Because what that presupposes is that there is some sort of physical manifestation of this reality in the spirit world, and I don't accept that. I can't accept it unless, of course, there might be combinations of multidimensional space that there might be 4 dimensions.
Yeah.
In spirit, in hyperspace. That
it sounds similar to what the people that have out of body experiences, like a guy called Graham Nichols, who I've talked with.
Okay.
Who has out of body experiences, and you see it online. It's called astral projection, a lot of it.
Yeah.
And it's usually you come out of your body and you're in kind of what they call the etheric body or the astral body, which is very similar. But
he's the
energy.
He's the guy that can do it at will, can't he? He can. Yes. I think he was at the same conference that Sartori was at. Yes. Go on, carry on.
Yeah, most probably. And so they come out of their body and they're in these etheric bodies that are connected with the silver cord, they say, to the physical, which at death is separated. And they say they're in kind of an environment which is very, very similar to the physical, but in a slightly less or slightly more plastic way, in which your mind can influence and adjust the surroundings. You think of a pink spotty dragon or something, and a pink spotty dragon comes up and sits on your bed or something.
Yes.
And they say it's very much like that, but it's like Earth, but on a slightly higher level. But of course, you can't verify, unless in certain situations, you can't verify that, because if it's still on a slightly different wavelength, not everything is exactly the same.
No, and what's more, you can't be sure that what you're witnessing when you have an out of body experience is the same reality as the one that you've left. So even you could witness something that's in a different reality that when you come back can't be verified in this reality because you were in a
yeah. Although I know Graham has his experience was, I can't remember which bombings it was, but he saw an event where a bomb exploded in a pub, an attack, and I think it was a couple of days later or a couple of weeks. I think it was a couple of days later. It was reported that.
Was that the Soho bomb? I think it was, wasn't it?
Yes, that's it. Yeah.
Yeah. I read about that. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I know that ions are currently doing some experiments on what Dean is calling. He calls it presentiment. I call it presentiment.
Presentiment.
Yeah. Which is basically they think that events from the future could possibly be leaking backwards in time, and I think I might be misquoting the experiment now, but there's an experiment where they show participants pictures on the screen and they measure their emotional response to the pictures. And some of the pictures are like cute babies or fluffy puppies. Some of them are landscapes. Some of them are people with the guts ripped out. Some of them are sexual. Some of them are violence. Pictures designed to stimulate the emotion.
Yeah.
And what they're discovering is that people are beginning their emotional response is detectable prior to the picture actually displaying. And it's anybody's guess as to what the explanation of that is, but I think they've got it down now to about 4 seconds presentiment.
That's a considerable amount, isn't it?
That's very significant. That's very significant.
Yeah.
I know that. By the way, when she left the project for remote viewing, she worked for a while with a group of day traders on the New York Stock Exchange, where they were using their psychic powers to forecast daily movements, not long-term trends, but daily movements in stocks. And I didn't talk to her in detail about it, But I said, was it successful? And she said, well, it was for a short while until we all got bored with it.
Hmm.
And once they got bored and they lost their intention to do it or their motivation to do it, it stopped working. Just as a throwaway comment, she just mentioned in passing that some of the extraterrestrials that are interacting with the human race at the moment have not got our best interests at heart. So, and we didn't manage to pursue that very much further. But if you get a chance to speak to them, it might be worth asking about.
I'll bring that up. Yeah.